Hello, High Rock. I'm so glad to be with you today and delighted that I get to kick off our new message series. But before we dive in, let me ask you a question. When you were growing up, did your parents play favorites? Now, this obviously doesn't apply to you if you were an only child. Well, actually, one of my closest friends in high school was an only child. But on their family Christmas card each year, his mom would sign the names of the parents first, the names of the two corgis second, and then finally, my friend's name. So, was there a favorite in your family? Let's make this interactive. If there was a favorite in your family, just raise your hand so others know they're not alone. Okay, one more question. Were you the favorite? Go ahead, raise that hand. When I was growing up, I had two younger brothers. I grew up thinking that the youngest was the favorite. After all, he seemed to get all the freedoms and privileges that I had to wait for. Later on, I realized that our parents were just worn out by the time Sean came around. In truth, I think I was the favorite. All that Tiger Mom academic pressure, all those piano lessons, I grew up thinking that those were forms of torture reserved just for me, when actually, I think they were investments. In contrast, our middle brother, Eugene, slipped by largely unnoticed by our Tiger Mom. Most middle children seem to want attention, but in our pressure cooker family, he sometimes seemed to enjoy the invisibility of being a middle child. Some of you perhaps experienced this dynamic outside of your families. Maybe you had a kid in your class who always seemed to be the teacher's pet. Or maybe there was that popular kid who handed out the best friend designation, like a carrot on a stick. Sure, you were my best friend last week, but what have you done for me lately? Hey, my family is going to the Cape next week, and my parents say I can take one friend. I wonder who my best friend is this week. You know the kid. If not, maybe you were the kid. I shake my head and laugh about it now, but these experiences once haunted me. My dad started to try to compensate for the lack of attention that our middle brother Eugene received. But when I started to notice my dad giving him extra attention, it made me jealous and spiteful towards my brother and resentful toward my dad. I used to think that our family was messed up, but it was nothing compared to the family we just read about in that Bible passage. That family could teach a master class in playing favorites with all the resulting competition and resentment you might expect. In fact, I want to give us all a chance to engage our imaginations and consider what life must have been like for this family. You can ponder these questions privately with God, or turn to a few of the people who are around you, or share in the online chat. Welcome back. I hope those questions and this text sparked some engaging thoughts and conversations. Today we're starting a new sermon series called Broken Links. We're all looking for connections that should be there, but aren't. We've all encountered that frustration when clicking on a link on a website, only to be greeted with an error message. Sometimes a website will use humor to ease the frustration a little. Or maybe it's more on brand to turn to intellectual wit when faced with frustration. We use those same tools of wit and humor when dealing with the broken connections in our own lives. But God wants something more. God wants to restore those connections And this fall, we'll be looking at several strained relationships in the Bible in the hopes of uncovering how to follow Jesus into the healing of those broken links. When I first became a believer and started reading the Bible for myself, I was shocked at how messed up so many of the families were. I guess I expected something more like the images of baby Jesus receiving tender care from Mary and Joseph. Instead, in the very first book of the Bible, in the very first family, we see brother killing brother because of rivalry and jealousy. And that same rivalry and jealousy would threaten the family that we're reading about today. In this story, we're being introduced to what may be the most famous family in the entire Bible. The father, Isaac, was the miracle child promised to Abraham and Sarah. And one of Isaac's and Rebekah's sons would one day receive the new name Israel. That child would become the father of the 12 tribes that formed the people of God. But as we'll see, it started out as a broken mess. After receiving an answer to their prayer, Rebekah became pregnant, but something unusual was going on. It turns out that she was having twins. They weren't even born yet, but they were already fighting. The older son was Esau, which means hairy. Some babies are born with a full head of hair. Esau was born with a full body of hair. The kid looked like a barnyard animal, which is going to come into play later. Jacob, the younger by just a few minutes, came out still wrestling with Esau, still grasping onto his brother's heel. They gave him a name that sounds like the word heel, and it became a playful way to call someone a liar or someone who trips you up through deception. And more on that later as well. Their obvious differences would only increase. Esau, the hairy one, leaned hard into the masculine stereotype and became an outdoorsman and hunter, while Jacob stayed closer to home, managing the flocks and domestic relationships. In a healthy family or community, differences can create diversity rather than division. But this was not a healthy family. Rather than celebrate their differences, these parents each picked a favorite. Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. It's like these brothers didn't even have a chance. When we grow up encountering favoritism, we are likely to experience it as a judgment on us. We're either worthy of love or not. And if we're not, we want to do whatever we can to become worthy of the love we need. We look for clues to see what our mom wants, or our dad, or our friends, or our teachers, or eventually our bosses and the mobs on social media. There's nothing wrong with wanting to please people, but when we're in a competition to validate our own existence, that's just too heavy a burden for anyone, especially a child. Sometimes we start out in life just being handed a set of links that are already broken. Look at how their parents doled out love and affection. Isaac loved wild game, so he loved his son Esau, the hunter. Rebekah loved Jacob, but we're not told why. Perhaps it was because he always stayed close to home, a real mama's boy. Or maybe it was because of what God had earlier revealed to Rebekah, that the two boys would compete with one another and the younger would be victorious. It's not clear that she ever shared that divine news with Isaac, and maybe she favored Jacob because she knew he would be the winner in a competition where second place is first loser. Everyone in this story is operating from a scarcity mindset. A scarcity mindset is the mental framework that says that there is not enough to go around. Not enough food, not enough wealth, not enough respect, not enough love. So you'd better do whatever you have to come out on top. When you're operating with this worldview, competition kills connection. Broken links are inevitable when you're either a winner or else you're dead weight. I love that the Bible is unabashedly honest about the ungodly values embedded in this family. If we were just as honest, what values would we find embedded into our lives? So what happened to these twin babies? Well, they grew up into young men who continued a path of broken connections. One day, Esau was returning from a hunt when he came across Jacob. Jacob was likely out in the fields supervising the care of their family's flocks. Esau's hunt must have been unsuccessful because by the time he encountered Jacob, he was starving. Maybe literally. He probably thought, "Thank God, my brother will have food." He saw that Jacob was preparing a stew and he begged for some. What would you do if you were Jacob? On the one hand, you could bless your brother and maybe even begin to repair the broken link between you. On the other hand, you could use this situation to your own advantage. What would you do? Well, Jacob was never someone to waste an opportunity to trip someone up. So Jacob responds, "What? This stew? Sure, I could give you some of this stew. You could eat to your heart's content. But what do I get out of it? What are you going to do for me?" It all boiled down to one request. Jacob said, "I'll give you this stew in exchange for your birthright." Your birthright? Talk about inflation. But wait, what even is a birthright? In the ancient Near East, the birthright was a set of rights and responsibilities that was almost always bestowed upon a firstborn son. And it included the right to become the eventual head of the family, and it meant a double share of the inheritance. Esau hesitates at first, trying to dismiss the request, but Jacob is insistent, and Esau relents. He agrees to the deal. Jacob is a competitor. Don't hate the player, hate the game, right? Yes, competition destroys connection. But Jacob sees only one path to get ahead, and that's by tripping up his brother. We're left to imagine how the rest of their lives played out. Family meals must have been a dicey affair. But we are given a clear picture of where this competition led them, especially when their father Isaac was nearing the end of his life. The aging Isaac decided that it was time to bless his children. So he called in his favorite son Esau and told him to go hunt some wild game that Isaac loved so much. When Esau returned, Isaac would grant his blessing and they could celebrate. But remember, Isaac was not the only parent with a favorite. Rebekah quickly tells Jacob to go into the field and bring her 2 young goats so she can prepare a stew just the way Isaac likes it. And because Isaac is almost blind, Rebekah's plan is for Jacob to bring the stew to Isaac, pretending to be Esau, in order to trick their father into granting him the blessing. Phase 1 is complete. The stew is ready. Phase 2, deceive Isaac into thinking Jacob is actually Esau. Isaac is almost blind, but what about his senses of smell and touch? Rebekah takes Esau's finest robes and puts them on Jacob so that Jacob will also carry Esau's outdoorsy scent. But Esau is also incredibly hairy, remember? So Rebekah does a quick teen wolf makeover on Jacob and attaches goat skin to the backs of his hands and neck. But it was really the robes that were the master touch. When Isaac leans in, he smells the scent of Esau and grants his irreversible blessing. By the time Esau returns, it is too late. The deed is done. Esau can only weep when he discovers the treachery. Talk about broken links and severed connections. Esau understandably wants to kill Jacob, but he decides to wait until after their father passes away. Rebekah hears about Esau's threats and sends Jacob far away to stay with his uncle, her brother, which is another broken connection, but the best that she can offer. When I first became a believer in college, part of God's process of healing me was painful. The more I began to encounter Jesus in the scriptures and in my InterVarsity fellowship, the more I began to realize how unhealthy and ungodly my family's dynamics had been. I had internalized the conflict between my parents and the ways that it manifested as favoritism for one child or another. There wasn't enough love to go around. was there? But Jesus seemed to be pointing to a different answer. Filled with a growing sense of guilt and remorse, I went to my brother and said, "I'm sorry. I treated you terribly. I know that we were just kids and we were just acting out the drama we saw from our parents, but that's no excuse for the things I've done. I want to be real brothers. I'm so sorry. Will you forgive me?" We didn't come from a family that hugs, but Eugene and I embraced, and he forgave me, no questions. I had bullied and terrorized him for years, but he forgave me. Over time, we became best friends, and he was an incredible blessing to my own children until he passed away in 2008. To this day, I am so incredibly thankful to Jesus that he exposed the brokenness in me and in my family and provided a path to a restored connection. I hate to even imagine how I'd feel today if Eugene had passed away, leaving me with just a broken link. The groundbreaking book, Scarcity, breaks down the psychological, social, and economic effects of a scarcity mindset. According to doctors Mulanathan of Harvard and Shafir of Princeton, one of the most dangerous effects of a scarcity mindset is that it creates a mental myopia. This short-sightedness magnifies the importance of the here and now and diminishes the importance of what might happen in the future. Esau prioritized his present hunger rather than his future birthright. Jacob changed an opportunity for grace and hospitality into a crisis to exploit his brother. Isaac thought with his stomach without considering how his appetite would leave his family hungry in a far deeper way. And Rebekah perhaps failed to consider how her master plan would leave one or both of her children dead, if not for the larger plans of God. This scarcity mindset fueled their competition over their limited resources. Without a faith in the generosity of God, they tore each other down like feral animals fighting for scraps. In some ways, the manufactured drama of modern reality TV is tame compared to the twisted values that were embedded into many of the families in the Bible. These people are in the Bible not because of their inherent goodness, but because they are people deeply in need of rescue and redemption by God. Just like us. Now, Jacob's life is a long story. I believe more attention is given to him than anyone else in the book of Genesis. We're going to have to skip forward a bit to see how God resolves this scarcity mindset for Jacob. And I believe God's redemption of Jacob comes in two stages. First, when Jacob went to live with his uncle Laban, he quickly discovered that Laban was even more underhanded and manipulative than Jacob. Jacob had to experience a taste of his own medicine. Despite Laban's manipulative deceptions, Jacob began to experience God's generosity. Along the way, he began to learn that his life was ultimately in God's hands. When Laban's sons, Jacob's cousins, expressed their jealousy of Jacob's success, he is clear that his success is due to God's hand, not his own plans. So that's the first stage of Jacob's redemption. He could begin to escape the scarcity mindset. He could leave behind the competition that kills connection once he began to trust that he could rely on God's generosity. It was a lesson that might have taken as many as 2 decades to learn. A second stage in God's restoration of Jacob came shortly thereafter. The situation had become far too dangerous to stay with his uncle, but there was only one other place to go: back home. Jacob would have to cross the river and enter into the territory of his estranged brother, Esau. Their mother, Rebekah, had promised to send word to Jacob if Esau ever got past Jacob's betrayal, but that word never came. But Jacob was out of options. So Jacob sends word to Esau, and in that message he mentions the tremendous gifts that he is bringing to Esau. And when those messengers return, they bring word that Esau is coming to receive him, but with 400 armed men. In a panic, Jacob divides all his people and his possessions into two groups in the desperate hope that if Esau attacks one group, the other might be able to escape. Jacob had been scheming and competing his entire life to build up his wealth and family, but now he was in danger of losing it all in an instant. Was it all for nothing? And it was that night that Jacob famously wrestled with a mysterious stranger. Jacob refused to give up, and at daybreak, the stranger finally touched Jacob's hip, which wrenched it out of socket, leaving him with a lifelong limp, a lifelong reminder of this moment and this lesson. The stranger gave Jacob a new name, Israel, which means one who struggles or wrestles with God. In this incredibly enigmatic moment, Jacob realizes that this stranger was actually God. Whatever else might happen in Jacob's life, he would never forget that his life was ultimately in God's hands, a God who was generous and merciful. The next day, as Jacob crossed the river, he had his fateful encounter with the brother that he had betrayed. And rather than raining down fists, Esau rained down kisses and tears as they embraced. I can't help but think of the embrace Eugene gave me when I asked for his forgiveness. Jacob had to learn that all he had gained was only possible through God's generosity, and he had to learn that he could easily lose all of it in a moment if not for God's sustaining grace. Rather than a mindset of scarcity, he could have a mindset of abundance, an abundance rooted in the unshakable foundation of the generous riches of God. Might God lead us to the same place? Let me suggest two biblical practices that can help us take the same journey as Jacob, hopefully without the lifelong limp. The first is remembrance. A scarcity mindset leaves us short-sighted and locked into the present moment. But by remembering God's past faithfulness, we can have a better way to interpret present circumstances. This is why the Bible speaks of forgetfulness as one of our greatest underlying weaknesses. I think it's wonderful when small groups talk about highs and lows from the previous week or share God sightings, ways that they have seen God at work. Without this practice of remembrance, we can so easily forget. We need the regular practice of noticing and remembering the many ways that God has proven to be faithful, not just in the Bible, but in our own lives. A few nights ago, my college-aged daughter, Jasmine, asked me to tell her something about myself that I had never told her before. So I shared with her the moment when I was driving back to Boston from the funeral of a friend's mom out in Pittsburgh. And on the way back, I was caught in a blizzard and ended up pulling off the turnpike at the very exit that would take me to Carnegie Mellon, which is where I had given my life to Christ almost 20 years earlier. I shared with Jasmine the pain I had been going through as a college-aged young adult like her, much of it connected to my own family. I shared how I felt led to return to the very spot where I had asked God to take my broken life and do something with it. And there I was, caught in a blizzard 20 years later, feeling all those old memories and emotions flooding back. God had answered that prayer from 20 years earlier. God had been faithful and merciful to me. Remembering God's faithfulness was like the renewing of my soul, and sharing that moment with my daughter was a deeper connection for us as well. God gave Jacob a lifelong limp so that he would never forget. Some of us here carry around lifelong wounds that are perhaps not so visible, but just as powerful. Even those wounds can be an opportunity to remember God's faithfulness. So the first practice is to remember God's faithfulness. The second is to actually express that gratitude. Gratitude can come out in prayer or praise and worship. I think keeping a gratitude journal can be a powerful way to engage in this practice. Just write down the ways that you experience God's faithfulness. Every Sunday night at 8 p.m., I receive a reminder from my electronic calendar to put another note in my gratitude journal. But why is gratitude so important? Well, in one experiment on the effects of the scarcity mindset, back when they had phone booths, you remember those days? They randomly placed a dollar coin in the coin return slot. So some people would find a dollar coin and others would not. Now, as all those people exited the phone booth, they would see a person, an actor, stumble and drop the binders that they were carrying. Now, of those who had just found a dollar coin, they were more than 90% likely to help the stranger. Of those who had not found a coin, they were less than half as likely to help. All because of a dollar. But it's so much more than that. It's the mindset of abundance versus the mindset of scarcity. With a scarcity mindset, Jacob was ready to justify betraying his behavior. With a life more rooted in God's hands, he could face his greatest fears. Remembrance of God's past faithfulness and the demonstration of gratitude, these practices can likewise lead us to the place of trust. And maybe that trust could mean you stop wrestling with others and with God over what seem like limited resources to you. To trust that in blessing others, you too will be blessed. Or maybe that trust could manifest as a willingness to repair some of the broken connections in your life. Jacob had to be running from an evil uncle and wrestling all night with God before he was willing to risk facing his brother. I hope that it might take less motivation for us. I'm so thankful to God that I was able to make peace with my brother Eugene. And not just peace, but to have a truly wonderful relationship. I'm so sorry that he's gone, but I would be inconsolable if I had missed the opportunity that Jesus gave me to ask for forgiveness and to receive it. Jesus is here to restore your broken links with one another and with God. Can you trust that God's love and grace is abundant enough for you? The monk Thomas Merton famously wrote that in order to love others the way that God desires, we first have to believe that we are loved by God. And that's my prayer for all of us today, that we might remember God's abundant blessing and to share our gratitude for God's care, all so that we might live generous and restored lives.